It didn't feel like a complaint anymore. It felt like a setup. Karen smiled, her son nodded, and somehow I became the one being watched. All I did was document what they were doing. I followed the rules, stayed civil, but that didn't seem to matter. Once I said no to their offer on my Harley, things started unraveling fast. Little things at first calls, notes, friendly warnings. But the scariest part, the way it all lined up like someone had planned it. I've seen stories like that on QA stories. This one felt personal. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt outnumbered in your own neighborhood. The first time Karen called the cops on me, I was tightening the last bolt on my Harley engine still warm. Blue lights rolled in before I could grab my coffee. That should have been my warning. But hinges of hell, I thought it was just another Tuesday in Willowbrook Heights, where the lawns stay perfect and everyone pretends to like each other at the mailbox. My name's Logan, and before this whole nightmare started, I thought living in a decent suburb meant peace and quiet. Boy, was I wrong about that. Karen Thompson appeared at my driveway like she owned the place, her son Chad trailing behind her like a well-dressed shadow. She was 52 years old, sharp as a blade in her black business suit, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Chad was 25, built like he lived at the gym, but with dead eyes that told you the brain wasn't getting much oxygen. Her heels cracked the gravel like they had authority stamped on each step. Chad's eyes locked onto my 2015 Harley-Davidson Street Glide, like he was calculating its value down to the penny. I work in community legal advocacy and used to investigate HOA finances, so I knew trouble when I saw it walking up my driveway. "Nice bike," Chad said, running his finger along the chrome like he already owned it. "I'll give you 20 grand for it right now." I actually had to stop and stare at him after that one. $20,000 for a bike worth nearly 30. Either this kid was horrible at math or he thought I was stupid. "I appreciate the offer, but she's not for sale," I told him, keeping my voice polite but firm. The way his face shifted told me he wasn't used to hearing the word no. "Come on, man, 20 grand cash right now. That's more than fair." Chad pressed his voice, taking on an edge that made my skin crawl. "Everything's for sale, dude. You just don't know your price yet." There was something in his tone that reminded me of corporate executives right before they fired someone for asking too many questions. "Like I said, not interested," I repeated, turning back to my bike. Chad just stood there watching me work, and after about 5 minutes of awkward silence, he finally spoke up again. "You know this neighborhood has rules about noise and stuff. Motorcycles can be pretty disruptive to the community peace." But Karen had been silent through this whole exchange, just watching and listening, like she was taking mental notes. When Chad's subtle threat hung in the air, she stepped forward with that calculating smile. "I'm Sharon Thompson, HOA president," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I believe we'll be seeing more of each other." The way she said it made it sound less like a prediction and more like a promise. She didn't argue about the bike sale or make any immediate threats. She didn't argue, just snapped a photo of my plate and said, "You'll regret this." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made enemies I didn't even know I had. The look in Chad's eyes when I'd refused his lowball offer wasn't just disappointment. It was the kind of cold calculation you see in people who've never been told no in their entire lives. Karen's photo of my license plate felt like she was building a case against me, and I had no idea what kind of charges she planned to file. I'd dealt with entitled people before in my line of work, but something about this mother-son duo felt different, more dangerous, more systematic. The next morning, I found Chad had posted a photo of my Harley on the neighborhood social media forum, with the caption, "This bike violates noise, ordinance's owner refuses to cooperate with the community." The post already had 12 likes and several comments agreeing that motorcycles were inappropriate for family neighborhoods. I stared at my phone screen reading that post over and over, waiting for it to make sense. He'd basically invited the entire neighborhood to gang up on me because I wouldn't sell him my bike for $8,000 less than it was worth. That afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello, this is Sharon Thompson. I heard there's been some trouble with your vehicle." The voice was crisp and professional, like she was calling about a business matter instead of harassment. "I'm the HOA president for Willowbrook Heights. I understand there may be some community concerns about noise violations." The way she said it made it sound like my bike had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months instead of sitting quietly in my assigned parking spot. "There haven't been any actual complaints filed," I told her. Well, that could change very quickly, she replied, and then hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my driveway trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. Was this woman seriously threatening to manufacture complaints against me because her son couldn't handle being told no? It seemed too ridiculous to be real, but the evidence was right there on the neighborhood forum. Chad's Beast was gathering momentum with more residents chiming in about the problems with motorcycles in residential areas. People I'd been saying hello to for 2 years were suddenly talking about me like I was some kind of public menace. 14 hours later, I found an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door. $150 for motorcycle noise violation, with a date and time that supposedly corresponded to when I'd started my bike 3 days earlier. The funny thing was, I'd been out of town on business that entire day and hadn't even been home, let alone started my motorcycle. I stared at that paper, my professional instincts kicking in from years of investigating financial fraud and procedural violations. Someone was building a case against me, and they weren't being subtle about it. The violation notice had official letterhead, detailed timestamps, and even referenced specific HOA bylaws that I'd never heard of before. But what really bothered me wasn't the money or even the false accusation. It was the realization that I was dealing with people who would lie on official documents to get what they wanted. This wasn't just about a motorcycle anymore. This was about power control and what happened when entitled people didn't get their way. I held that violation notice and felt my gut twist with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. I hadn't even locked the garage when 2 squad cars pulled into my driveway. The officers looked confused when they saw me standing there with a wrench in my hand, clearly not the dangerous criminal they'd been called to investigate. "Sir, we received a complaint about threatening behavior and possible harassment," one of them said, glancing at my motorcycle like it might explode. I looked at those cops, then at the HOA violation notice still in my hand, and realized that Karen Thompson had just declared war. Was this just the beginning of their game? Or had I already lost without knowing it? The cops left after 20 minutes, but the damage was done. Karen had made her point crystal clear. She could mobilize law enforcement with a phone call, and I was officially on her radar. The next morning brought a thick manila envelope stuffed with papers that made my blood pressure spike just looking at the return address. Inside were 3 separate violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. $200 for improper parking, because apparently my motorcycle was 6 inches outside some invisible line. $100 for aesthetic non-compliance, because my bike didn't match the visual harmony of the community. And the real kicker, $250 for disturbing activity related to excessive vehicle maintenance in visible areas. She waved a clipboard like a warrant. I recognized the template, legalese logos and fake authority. "Mr. Walker, I trust you've received our correspondence regarding the multiple violations," Karen said, standing on my doorstep like she was conducting official business. "The HOA board has voted to implement immediate enforcement measures to address ongoing community disruption issues." Her tone was perfectly reasonable, but there was something underneath it that made me think of a snake coiled up and ready to strike. These aren't just suggestions anymore. We're implementing a formal compliance protocol with escalating penalties for continued non-cooperation. I grabbed the documents and started reading through the fine print, looking for the legal loopholes I knew had to be there. What I found was even worse than I'd expected. They'd cited California Civil Code sections that didn't exist, referenced HOA bylaws that contradicted the actual community guidelines, and created enforcement procedures that violated basic due process requirements. "These violations are based on false information," I told Karen, pointing to the dates and times on the notices. I wasn't even home on 2 of these days. She just smiled that calculating smile and made a note on her clipboard. "Disputes can be filed through proper channels, but penalties remain in effect during the review process." They weren't just filing complaints anymore, they were giving ultimatums. Karen handed me another document with official letterhead and a 3-day compliance deadline. "This is a cease and desist notice regarding continued violation of community standards," she explained like she was doing me a favor. "Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in additional penalties and possible legal action." I stared at that deadline, feeling the walls closing in around me. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was systematic persecution, using bureaucratic weapons I'd seen corrupt officials wield against people who couldn't fight back. You have 3 days to remove the motorcycle from community property or face escalating enforcement measures. Karen continued, her voice taking on the tone of a judge reading a sentence. I placed the phone behind a row of books. My hands trembled not from fear, from the rage of being cornered by paper threats. I'm not moving my bike from my assigned parking spot, I told her. It's legal registered, and I have every right to park it there. Karen just made another note on her clipboard. Legal rights are subject to community standards, Mr. Walker. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the difference. That afternoon, I was loading groceries when my neighbor Jake Martinez approached me looking nervous. Hey man, you should know that Karen's been going door to door asking about your motorcycle, he said, glancing around like he was worried someone might be listening. She's got this petition about noise complaints, but most people are signing it without reading the fine print. Jake lowered his voice even more. You're braver than the last guy, he said. He lasted 3 weeks. The way he said it made my stomach drop. What happened to him? I asked. Jake just shrugged, moved away, said it wasn't worth the fight. The revelation that Karen had done this before changed everything. This wasn't about my motorcycle or community standards. This was her standard operating procedure for getting rid of people she didn't like. I spent the rest of the day researching Karen Thompson and the Willowbrook Heights HOA using the same investigative techniques I'd learned from years of tracking financial fraud. What I found in the public records made my blood boil. There was a pattern of residents being systematically harassed until they either paid inflated fines or moved away. Always the same tactics. Always the same escalating pressure. I decided to dig deeper into the HOA's financial records, which were supposed to be available to all residents upon request. When I called the management company, they told me I'd need to submit a formal written request and wait 10 business days for processing. That's interesting, I said. California law requires HOA financial records to be available within 5 business days. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'll have to check with the board president about your request, the woman finally said. Another red flag? Another sign that something wasn't right about the way this community was being run. 2 days later, I found another envelope taped to my garage door. This time, it wasn't just violations or complaints. It wasn't a complaint this time. It was an accusation. Notice of trespassing violation, read the header, followed by detailed allegations that I'd been unlawfully accessing community property and engaging in surveillance activities against other residents. The document claimed I'd been seen taking photographs of other people's homes and vehicles, which was complete fiction. But the scary part was how official it looked. Professional letterhead, case numbers, legal references. If I didn't know better, I might have believed it myself. I stared at that trespassing accusation, trying to wrap my head around the sheer audacity of it. Karen wasn't just manufacturing complaints anymore. She was creating an entirely fictional narrative where I was the villain, and she was protecting the community from my dangerous behavior. The document even included witness statements from unnamed residents who had supposedly seen me acting suspiciously. Every word was carefully crafted to make me sound like a threat to community safety, while giving Karen legal cover for her harassment campaign. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Jake had said about the previous resident who'd lasted 3 weeks before giving up and moving away. How many other people had Karen terrorized out of their homes? How many had paid her inflated fines just to make the harassment stop? I'd spent years investigating corruption in nonprofit organizations, and I recognized the pattern. Create fake violations, escalate pressure systematically, and keep pushing until the target either pays up or gives up. It was extortion disguised as community management, and I was apparently her latest victim. The next morning brought the final escalation. Another envelope, another set of documents, but this time the stakes had been raised significantly. Notice of community access suspension, read the header, followed by detailed restrictions on my use of shared community spaces, including the pool fitness center and even the walking paths. According to the document, my pattern of disruptive behavior had resulted in a board vote to limit my access to community amenities until all violations were resolved. Was this justice finally calling, or was I about to learn what real revenge looks like? The community access suspension was the last straw. I'd been patient, professional, and polite through weeks of escalating harassment, but now Karen had crossed a line that demanded action. I spent the entire weekend diving into HOA law, community regulations, and the specific bylaws that governed Willowbrook Heights. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of procedural violations that would make any competent lawyer salivate. Karen had been operating outside the legal boundaries of her authority for so long that she'd apparently forgotten there were any boundaries at all. The first smoking gun came when I cross-referenced the violation notices with the actual HOA covenants. They said my firewood stack was aggressively visible, whatever that meant. Half the citations referenced regulations that didn't exist in our community guidelines, and the other half were applied selectively in ways that would never hold up under legal scrutiny. Karen had been making up rules as she went along, confident that most residents wouldn't challenge her authority or know enough about HOA law to call her bluff. But I wasn't most residents, and I'd spent 15 years dismantling fake nonprofits that used similar tactics. I requested copies of all HOA board meeting minutes from the past year, and what I found made my stomach turn. According to the official records, I'd apparently attended several meetings where I'd voted in favor of policies I'd never heard of and agreed to assessments I'd never seen. I dropped the page. My name was there, approving things I'd never heard of. The minutes showed me supporting increased enforcement measures, voting for higher penalty fees, and even volunteering to serve on a community standards committee that didn't exist. Karen had been forging my consent to legitimize her increasingly authoritarian policies, but the real breakthrough came when I started following the money trail. Buried in the financial disclosure documents was a line item for maintenance services provided by something called Chadstone Maintenance LLC. The invoices showed regular payments of $2,000 to $3,000 per month for community improvement projects that I'd never seen evidence of anywhere in the neighborhood. I checked the business registry. Chadstone LLC belonged to Chad Peabody. Of course it did. Karen's son had been billing the HOA for phantom services while his mother manufactured violations to fund the scam. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over the past 18 months, Chadstone Maintenance had received over $40,000 in payments for everything from drainage improvements to security enhancements to aesthetic consulting. None of these projects had ever been completed, discussed at board meetings, or even mentioned to residents. Karen had been systematically looting the community's budget while using her position to eliminate anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about where the money was going. I needed concrete evidence of the fraud in action, not just suspicious paperwork. I invited a friend to attend the next board meeting and live stream under the guise of filming a vlog about community governance. Marcus was a freelance journalist who specialized in local corruption stories, and he jumped at the chance to document Karen's operation firsthand. "This is either going to be really boring or really explosive," he told me while setting up his equipment. "Either way, we'll have everything on camera." The livest stream would create an unalterable record of whatever happened at the meeting. The monthly HOA board meeting was held in the community center conference room, and Karen clearly wasn't expecting any residents to actually attend. She walked in with her usual clipboard and started the meeting without checking for attendees or following any kind of formal procedure. "First order of business is the ongoing enforcement issues with the Walker property," she announced to the nearly empty room. "The board has voted to implement additional penalties and explore legal options for continued non-compliance." She was conducting official business with no quorum, no proper notice, and no actual board members present besides herself. Marcus kept filming as Karen went through the motions of a legitimate meeting, while essentially talking to herself about my various violations and the need for stronger enforcement measures. She read from prepared statements that made it sound like the entire community was up in arms about my motorcycle-cited legal authorities that didn't exist and approved expenditures for Chadstone maintenance services that were never defined or explained. The community safety assessment indicates elevated risk factors requiring immediate intervention, she said, making notes on forms that she'd apparently created herself. The most damaging evidence came when Karen started discussing resident removal procedures and the possibility of forcing me to sell my property if I continued to violate community standards. "Some residents simply aren't a good fit for our neighborhood character," she said while flipping through a folder labeled with my name. "We have options available to address persistent compliance issues that protect the majority from disruptive individuals." She was planning to use fabricated violations and manufactured legal pressure to force me out of my own home. When Karen noticed Marcus filming, her demeanor changed instantly. "Excuse me, recording is not permitted at board meetings without prior approval," she snapped, moving toward his camera like she was going to physically stop him. This is a private community function, and you're trespassing on HOA property. Marcus calmly explained that the meeting was supposed to be open to all residents and that he had every right to document public proceedings. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately, or I'll call security, Karen threatened, even though there was no security to call. The confrontation escalated when Karen tried to grab Marcus's camera and accidentally knocked over a stack of financial documents she'd brought to the meeting. Papers scattered across the floor, including several invoices from Chadstone Maintenance and bank deposit slips showing payments into personal accounts. Marcus kept filming as I helped gather the scattered papers, and we both saw the evidence of the money trail that connected Karen's enforcement campaign to her son's fraudulent billing scheme. "You have no right to those documents," Karen screamed, but it was too late. Everything was on camera. They passed the motion. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. I was exiled. According to the official vote that Karen conducted with herself, I was now banned from all community facilities, subject to additional penalties for any future violations, and facing potential legal action for harassment of community officials. The irony wasn't lost on me that the person systematically defrauding the HOA was accusing me of harassment while literally stealing money from my neighbors. But now I had everything on video, and Karen had no idea what kind of evidence she'd just handed me. Printouts, drone shots, emails. Everything had a timestamp and none matched their lies. I spent the next 3 days organizing evidence like I was preparing for a federal investigation, because that's essentially what this had become. Karen's fraud scheme wasn't just about harassing me anymore. It was systematic theft from an entire community, and I had the documentation to prove it. Financial records showing phantom payments to Chad's company, video evidence of Karen conducting illegal meetings, and a paper trail of fabricated violations that violated every principle of due process. The decision wasn't easy. Going to the DA meant war, but staying quiet meant surrender. I'd spent 15 years investigating nonprofit fraud, and I knew that people like Karen never stopped on their own. They just kept escalating until someone with the knowledge and resources to fight back finally stood up to them. The question wasn't whether I should take action. It was whether I was prepared for the consequences of becoming Karen's primary target instead of just another victim who'd eventually give up and move away. I reached out to Russell Dean, a prosecutor I'd worked with on several financial fraud cases over the years. Russell specialized in white-collar crime and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to corrupt officials who abused positions of trust. This is exactly the kind of systematic fraud that makes my job interesting. He told me after reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. "You've documented clear patterns of embezzlement, procedural violations, and what looks like organized conspiracy between a mother and son. The video evidence alone is probably enough for criminal charges." Russell walked me through the process of filing a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, but he also warned me about what to expect once the investigation began. "People like Karen Thompson don't go down quietly," he explained. "She's going to escalate her harassment campaign the moment she realizes she's under investigation. Document everything from this point forward and be prepared for her to get desperate." His words proved prophetic faster than either of us expected. That Thursday, I attended the monthly town hall meeting where residents could address the city council about community issues. I'd requested time on the agenda to discuss concerns about HOA governance and financial transparency, which was bureaucratic speak for "I'm about to blow the whistle on systematic fraud." Karen was sitting in the front row when I walked in, probably wondering why I was there, instead of hiding at home like her previous victims. I didn't say a word, just slid the folder across the table as Karen walked in. The folder contained copies of everything: forged meeting minutes, fraudulent invoices, bank records showing payments to Chadstone Maintenance, and a detailed timeline of Karen's escalating harassment campaign against multiple residents. District Clerk Patricia Hayes accepted the documents with the kind of serious expression that suggested she understood the gravity of what I was alleging. "These are very serious accusations, Mr. Walker," she said loud enough for the entire room to hear. "We'll need to review everything carefully and coordinate with the appropriate authorities." Karen's face went through several different expressions as she realized what was happening. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like panic before settling into cold rage. She stood up abruptly and walked out of the meeting without saying a word, but not before shooting me a look that promised retaliation. I'd just declared open war against someone who'd been systematically abusing her authority for years, and I knew the next phase of this conflict was going to test every skill I'd learned from investigating corruption. The formal investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 48 hours, Russell called to tell me that the DA's office had assigned a financial crimes unit to review the evidence I'd provided. They're particularly interested in the video footage and the bank records, he explained. Forged meeting minutes are one thing, but documented payments to fake companies owned by family members crosses the line into federal fraud territory. The FBI might get involved if the investigation uncovered interstate banking violations or mail fraud charges. I've spent 15 years dismantling fake nonprofits. I know this game. Karen's operation followed the same pattern I'd seen in corrupt nonprofit organizations. Create fake expenses, manufacture justifications for increased fees, eliminate oversight through intimidation, and systematically loot the budget while maintaining a facade of legitimate governance. The only difference was that she was doing it to a residential community instead of a charitable organization. The tactics were identical, and so were the legal vulnerabilities. But Karen wasn't finished with her own escalation campaign. 2 days after the town hall meeting, I received a certified letter from something called Community Legal Services, threatening immediate legal action for defamation, harassment, and intentional interference with community governance. The letter demanded that I cease all investigative activities and publicly retract my false accusations against the HOA board. It was an obvious intimidation tactic, but it showed that Karen was getting desperate enough to bring in outside legal help. The letter was followed by increased surveillance that made my skin crawl. I started noticing the same car parked across from my house at different times of day, and neighbors mentioned that people had been asking questions about my schedule and activities. Chad was apparently conducting his own investigation, trying to gather ammunition for whatever counterattack his mother was planning. The harassment was becoming more sophisticated and more personal, which told me that I'd hit something important enough to make them panic. Friday afternoon brought the escalation I'd been dreading. I came home from work to find my mailbox stuffed with official-looking documents, but these weren't from the HOA anymore. Someone had filed complaints against me with the state licensing board that governed my professional credentials, alleging that I'd been using my position as a legal advocate to harass community officials and abuse my access to public records. It was a direct attack on my career and livelihood, designed to destroy my ability to fight back by eliminating my professional standing. The licensing board complaint was clearly coordinated with Karen's legal strategy, but it also showed how far she was willing to go to protect her fraud scheme. She wasn't just trying to force me out of the neighborhood anymore. She was trying to destroy my professional reputation and eliminate my ability to earn a living. This had escalated from community harassment to systematic personal destruction, and I realized that Karen viewed me as an existential threat to everything she'd built. No caption, just a photo of me in my yard, taken last night. The anonymous envelope arrived Saturday morning with no return address and no explanation, but the message was crystal clear. Someone had been on my property in the dark, close enough to photograph me through my kitchen window, and wanted me to know that they could get to me whenever they wanted. The photo showed me washing dishes, completely unaware that I was being watched and documented. Was this justice finally calling, or was I about to learn what real revenge looks like? The SUV didn't move for hours. Its windows were tinted and the engine stayed running. I first noticed it Tuesday morning while loading my motorcycle gear, a black Suburban parked across the street with a clear view of my driveway. By lunch, it was still there. By dinner, I was starting to feel like a lab rat being studied by researchers who wanted to see how long it would take me to crack under pressure. When I stepped out with a flashlight around 10 p.m., it drove off without headlights. That's when I knew Karen had escalated from legal harassment to actual surveillance. The formal investigation into HOA fraud was apparently making her desperate enough to resort to intimidation tactics that crossed several legal lines. Russell had warned me that corrupt officials often got dangerous when they realized their schemes were falling apart, but I hadn't expected Karen to be bold enough to have me watched in my own neighborhood. The message was clear. She knew where I lived, she knew my schedule, and she wanted me to know that my every move was being monitored by people who didn't mind breaking traffic laws to avoid identification. Wednesday morning brought a new level of personal violation that made my skin crawl. Next morning, the laminated sheet was zip-tied to my Harley, HOA seal at the top, red ink underlined final warning. Someone had been on my property in the dark close enough to my motorcycle to attach documents directly to the seat. The violation notice cited continued noncompliance with community standards and threatened immediate legal action and asset seizure if I didn't remove the bike within 72 hours. Karen wasn't just manufacturing paperwork anymore. She was physically vandalizing my property. The escalation felt personal in a way that made me realize this had stopped being about HOA regulations a long time ago. Karen was fighting for her survival now, and she was using every weapon in her arsenal to make my life unbearable. The surveillance, the property invasion, the threats of asset seizure, these weren't the actions of someone trying to enforce legitimate community standards. These were the desperate tactics of someone who knew that exposure meant prison time and was willing to do whatever it took to eliminate the threat. I called Russell immediately and described the overnight visit to my motorcycle. "That's criminal trespassing and vandalism," he told me. "Document everything and file a police report. Karen's getting sloppy, which means she's scared. Scared people make mistakes, and mistakes create evidence." He was right about the evidence part, but he was wrong about Karen getting sloppy. If anything, she was getting more systematic about her intimidation campaign. The surveillance and property violations felt coordinated, like she'd done this before to other residents who'd challenged her authority. The psychological pressure was working exactly as Karen had intended. I found myself checking my rearview mirror, constantly looking over my shoulder when I walked to my car and feeling paranoid about every unfamiliar vehicle in the neighborhood. The knowledge that people were watching me, documenting my activities and planning their next move based on my schedule was wearing me down in ways that simple paperwork harassment never could. Karen understood that fear was more effective than fines when it came to forcing compliance. But the real gut punch came when I discovered that my support network was disappearing. Mark from Lot 7 waved at me like nothing happened. 2 nights ago, he was on my porch venting about Karen. Today, his porch had an HOA flag. The neighbor who had been my most vocal ally in opposing Karen's overreach had apparently switched sides overnight. Either he'd been intimidated into silence, or he'd been co-opted into Karen's network of informants. Either way, I was losing allies faster than I could document Karen's crimes. The HOA flag on Mark's porch wasn't just symbolic, it was a message. Karen was building a coalition of residents who were either too scared to oppose her or too invested in her system to risk challenging her authority. My investigation had forced her to consolidate power and eliminate potential witnesses, which meant that other residents were probably being pressured to choose sides. Anyone who had expressed sympathy for my situation was now being given the same choice: cooperate with Karen or face the same harassment campaign that was destroying my life. Friday afternoon brought the escalation I'd been dreading but expecting. I came home from work to find my mailbox wide open, hanging from its post, like someone had taken a crowbar to it. All my mail was gone, except for a single envelope containing nothing but a printed map of my property lot with red X marks over my house and garage. No words, no signature, just a clear message that Karen's people knew exactly where I lived and had been planning something that required detailed knowledge of my property layout. The property map felt like a threat assessment rather than simple intimidation. Someone had taken the time to print an official surveyor's map, mark specific buildings, and deliver it as a warning about what might happen next. This wasn't random vandalism or amateur harassment. This was the kind of systematic intimidation that suggested Karen had experience with this level of psychological warfare. The precision and planning involved made me realize that I wasn't just dealing with a corrupt HOA president. I was dealing with someone who'd turned community harassment into a science. The destroyed mailbox was a federal crime, which meant Karen had escalated beyond local harassment into territory that would attract FBI attention. Mail tampering carried serious penalties, and the theft of personal correspondence was exactly the kind of evidence that prosecutors loved because it was impossible to explain away as a misunderstanding. Karen's desperation was leading her to commit crimes that would be easy to prove and impossible to justify, which meant she was either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident that she could intimidate me into silence before the authorities caught up with her. That night, I sat in my living room with all the lights off, watching the street through my window and wondering how many other residents had received property maps and destroyed mailboxes before they'd finally given up and moved away. The pattern was becoming clear. Karen would escalate the harassment until her targets either submitted completely or fled the community entirely. She'd perfected a system of systematic intimidation that was sophisticated enough to avoid legal consequences while being brutal enough to force compliance from anyone who challenged her authority. My mailbox was wide open, all mail gone, except a single envelope with nothing but a printed map of my lot. The message was crystal clear, but so was my response. Karen had just crossed the line from civil harassment into federal crimes, and I had everything documented. The surveillance, the property violations, the mail theft. Every escalation was creating evidence that would be impossible for her to explain away in court. Was this justice finally calling, or was I about to learn what real revenge looks like? Every file led to the same name, Karen, or Chad, or one of their shell companies. The weekend after my mailbox was destroyed, I dedicated every waking hour to building an airtight case against the Thompson family criminal enterprise. What I discovered was a web of fraud so systematic and well organized that it made me wonder how many other communities were being victimized by similar schemes. The paper trail led through fake companies, forged documents, stolen mail, and financial records that showed a pattern of theft going back at least 3 years. The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced property records with HOA financial statements and discovered discrepancies that couldn't be explained by simple bookkeeping errors. Karen had been manipulating property assessments to increase her budget while simultaneously billing residents for services that were never provided. The mathematical precision of the fraud was actually impressive. She'd calculated exactly how much money she could steal without triggering automatic audits or raising suspicions among residents who weren't paying close attention to community finances. I had the proof. But what if they buried it in delays? What if the HOA board backed them and froze me out anyway? The evidence was overwhelming, but I'd seen corrupt organizations weather similar scandals by controlling the narrative and outlasting their accusers. Karen had been building her power base for years, and she had allies throughout the community who were either complicit in the fraud or too intimidated to speak up. Even with documented proof of criminal activity, there was no guarantee that justice would prevail over politics and fear. The doubt was eating at me when I made the discovery that changed everything. Buried in a stack of property easement documents was a permit application with my signature authorizing a land swap between my lot and community property that would have given the HOA control over part of my driveway, my signature, on a permit to authorize a land swap I never heard of. Dated 3 weeks ago, Karen hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been forging my consent to steal my actual property. The forged signature was the smoking gun I'd been looking for, because it proved intent and showed that Karen was willing to commit identity theft to advance her schemes. This wasn't just about inflated HOA fees or fake maintenance contracts anymore. This was about Karen systematically defrauding residents while stealing their property rights through fraudulent documentation. The scope of the criminal enterprise was much larger than I'd initially suspected, and the evidence was ironclad because handwriting analysis would easily prove the forgery. I'd seen nonprofits with fake boards launder state funds in Boston. Karen's web wasn't new to me, it was just sloppier. The Thompson family operation followed the same playbook I'd seen in corrupt charitable organizations create fake expenses manufacture, justifications for increased revenue, eliminate oversight through intimidation, and systematically loot the budget while maintaining a facade of legitimate governance. The only difference was the scale. Instead of stealing from donors, they were stealing from their own neighbors. The pattern recognition from my previous investigations gave me a roadmap for dismantling Karen's operation. I knew which documents would be most damaging in court, which agencies would be most interested in the different types of fraud I'd uncovered, and how to present the evidence in a way that would make prosecution inevitable. Karen had made the same mistakes that brought down every other criminal enterprise I'd investigated. She'd gotten greedy, left a paper trail, and underestimated the intelligence of her victims. The forged property documents were the final piece of evidence I needed to escalate this from a local HOA dispute to a federal investigation. Mail theft, identity theft, wire fraud, and organized conspiracy across state lines would attract attention from agencies that had the resources to prosecute complex financial crimes. Karen's local political connections wouldn't protect her from federal prosecutors who specialized in exactly this type of systematic fraud, and her intimidation tactics would only make her situation worse. I spent Sunday afternoon organizing everything into a comprehensive report that read like a federal indictment. Financial records, forged documents, video evidence, witness statements, and a detailed timeline that showed the progression from simple harassment to organized criminal activity. The evidence package was over 200 pages and included exhibits that would make Karen's guilt impossible to deny. Every transaction was documented, every forgery was highlighted, and every violation of federal law was clearly explained with supporting evidence. This wasn't just HOA mischief, it was fraud, and I had just turned it into a public record. Monday morning, I walked into the State Attorney General's office with copies of everything formally filed complaints with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit and sent documentation packages to every relevant oversight agency that had jurisdiction over community associations. I also copied the local newspaper, the county prosecutor, and the state licensing board that regulated HOA management companies. The decision to go public wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about protecting other potential victims and ensuring that Karen couldn't simply relocate her operation to another community once the heat died down. The press coverage would make her toxic to any HOA board that might consider hiring her, and the federal investigation would create a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Karen had spent years systematically destroying other people's lives, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of filing the complaints, I received calls from federal investigators, state auditors, and journalists who wanted to interview me about the scope of the fraud. Karen's operation had apparently been sophisticated enough to attract attention from multiple agencies that specialized in different aspects of financial crime. The mail theft alone was enough for federal charges, but the combination of wire fraud, identity theft, and organized conspiracy created a prosecutorial goldmine. Tuesday afternoon brought confirmation that the investigation had officially begun when I saw federal agents interviewing neighbors and photographing the community center where Karen had conducted her fraudulent board meetings. The sight of FBI badges in my neighborhood was both satisfying and terrifying. Satisfying because it meant Karen's crimes were being taken seriously, and terrifying because it meant I was now a federal witness in a case that could destroy lives and send people to prison for decades. This wasn't just HOA mischief, it was fraud, and I had just turned it into a public record. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but I knew that Karen's most dangerous phase was just beginning. Cornered criminals often became desperate enough to do things that rational people wouldn't consider, and Karen had already shown that she was willing to commit federal crimes to protect her operation. Was this justice finally calling, or was I about to learn what real revenge looks like? The hearing room smelled like dust and fear. Karen sat before the board, eyes darting. The clerk read my report word for word. 2 weeks after I'd filed complaints with every relevant agency, the Willowbrook Heights HOA was facing its first public accountability hearing in over a decade. The community center was packed with residents who had finally learned the scope of Karen's fraud, federal investigators, documenting everything for prosecution, and journalists who smelled the kind of corruption story that won awards and destroyed political careers. Karen looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, stripped of the power suit and commanding presence that had intimidated residents for years. She was wearing a simple gray dress and kept checking her phone like she was expecting rescue that wasn't coming. The federal investigation had frozen her assets, suspended her HOA authority, and placed her under criminal investigation for mail fraud, identity theft, and organized conspiracy. Her empire was collapsing in real time, and everyone could see the panic in her eyes. The State Attorney General's representative opened by reading a summary of charges that made Karen's crimes crystal clear to everyone present. Mrs. Thompson is accused of systematically defrauding community residents through false billing, forged documents, identity theft, and mail tampering over approximately 4 years. The estimated damages exceed $200,000. The number was staggering even to me, and I'd been investigating the fraud for months. The room fell silent as people processed the scope of the theft. When Karen was asked to respond, she stood slowly and delivered what sounded like a prepared statement. I categorically deny any intentional wrongdoing and maintain that all actions taken in my capacity as HOA president were conducted in accordance with community standards and legal requirements. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook badly enough that several people noticed. Any discrepancies in financial records are the result of bookkeeping errors rather than deliberate fraud. The defense sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The bookkeeping errors defense crumbled when the prosecutor introduced evidence, including my forged signature on property documents and video footage of Karen conducting illegal board meetings. Mrs. Thompson, can you explain how bookkeeping errors resulted in your son's company receiving over $60,000 for services that were never provided? The question hung in the air like a sword, and Karen's lawyer whispered frantically in her ear before she answered. I was not personally involved in vendor selection, she said, contradicted by her own signature on dozens of fraudulent invoices. Mark from Lot 7 stood up. I have something to add, he said, pulling out his phone. The room froze. I recorded some of our conversations about the harassment campaign because I was afraid of retaliation if I spoke up earlier. The recording that played through the community center speakers was devastating. Karen's voice clearly explained how to manufacture violations, coordinate surveillance, and pressure residents into compliance through systematic intimidation. Some people just need to be reminded that community standards aren't optional, her recorded voice said with chilling clarity. The audio evidence was the final nail in Karen's coffin because it proved intent and showed the harassment wasn't about HOA regulations, but about eliminating residents who might challenge her authority. The recording also implicated several other board members who'd been participating in the conspiracy, which meant the corruption went deeper than just the Thompson family. Karen's face went white when she heard her own voice discussing ways to make troublemakers disappear through strategic harassment and manufactured legal pressure that had destroyed multiple families. When the prosecutor asked Karen about the recording, she knocked her chair over and stormed out mid-session with her HOA badge still pinned crooked to her blazer. The dramatic exit was captured by news cameras and would become the defining image of her public humiliation. She didn't say another word, didn't try to defend herself, didn't even look back as she pushed through the crowd of residents who had been her victims. The woman who had terrorized an entire community was reduced to fleeing from the consequences of her own crimes. But the biggest shock came when investigators revealed that Chad had disappeared the night before the hearing. Chadstone LLC was gone. Website down, registry deactivated. He ran before the fallout hit. The coward had dissolved. His fraudulent company liquidated his bank accounts and apparently fled the state rather than face federal prosecution. Karen was left to face the music alone, while her son enjoyed the proceeds of their crimes from whatever hideout he'd chosen. The family that had terrorized residents together was falling apart under pressure and abandoning each other. The hearing concluded with the State Attorney General's office announcing a full criminal investigation that would include federal agencies with jurisdiction over mail fraud and interstate financial crimes. Karen would face charges carrying potential prison sentences of up to 20 years, and civil lawsuits from defrauded residents would probably bankrupt her, even if she avoided conviction. The HOA board was dissolved immediately, and a court-appointed administrator would oversee community finances until new elections could be held under judicial supervision with transparent oversight and accountability measures. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I sat on the porch watching the Harley glint in the morning sun and wondered what took me so long to fight back. The victory felt hollow because of all the residents who'd been driven away before anyone stood up to Karen's operation. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman forced to sell her home. The Hispanic family fined for displaying their cultural heritage. How many victims could have been spared if someone had fought back sooner instead of letting Karen's reign of terror continue unchecked? The community was finally free from Karen's tyranny, but the damage she'd inflicted would take years to repair. Property values had been artificially suppressed by her harassment campaigns. Community trust had been destroyed by surveillance and intimidation tactics, and many residents were still afraid to speak up because they'd been conditioned to expect retaliation. Karen had poisoned the well of community cooperation so thoroughly that rebuilding would require conscious effort from everyone who remained in the neighborhood. Federal investigators were still collecting evidence, and Karen would likely spend years facing charges, lawsuits, and financial oversight. Chad had vanished now, a fugitive trading peace of mind for temporary escape. Their empire collapsed, but the damage would linger for decades. A new HOA board was being formed under court supervision, and neighbors were slowly finding their voices again. Then 3 days later, an unmarked envelope appeared under my door. I braced for more trouble. Instead, it held a quiet thank you from a family Karen once drove away. Maybe justice doesn't show up until someone drags it into the light. If this one hit you hard and you'd like to support the channel, feel free to tap the little thanks button below. I'm still here listening.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.